My grandmother taught second grade for 31 years at Clover Hill Elementary in Knoxville, Tennessee. She retired the spring I turned 9, and the school threw her a party in the gymnasium with a banner that said, "We'll miss you, Mrs. Aldridge," in purple and gold, and the art teacher made a cake shaped like an open book. My grandmother stood at the center of it all in her good blue cardigan, smiling at every child who handed her a handmade card, and she looked like the happiest woman in the world. She died on a Tuesday in February 14 months ago, pneumonia. She was 77. The funeral home sent a car for me because I was the only one who lived close. My mother passed when I was 19, and my uncle, my grandmother's only son, lives in Phoenix now with his second wife and their 2 kids. He drove up from the airport the morning of the service. He flew back that same night. There were 11 people at the graveside. Former colleagues, a neighbor, a woman from her church whose name I didn't recognize. The minister said the right things. The wind off the ridge was cold even for February, and it cut right through my coat. I was standing at the edge of the gravel path afterward, trying to decide if I should go back to her house alone or drive straight home to Chattanooga, when a woman walked up to me. She was maybe 70, small-framed, white hair pulled back, wearing a dark wool coat and good shoes. She had the kind of posture that made you stand up straighter just by being near her. She wasn't from the church. I'd never seen her before. She said, "You're Nora's granddaughter." It wasn't a question. I said I was. She reached into her coat pocket and handed me a card. It was cream-colored, heavy stuck. On the front was a name, a law firm, and a phone number with a Memphis area code. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were 4 words. She made arrangements. Call. I looked up, but the woman was already walking away toward a dark blue sedan parked at the far end of the lane. I started to follow her, to ask who she was, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was that I'd been awake since 4 in the morning and I had cried more that week than I had in years and I didn't have anything left. I put the card in my coat pocket and drove back to my grandmother's house. She had lived in the same house on Sycamore Bend Road for 43 years. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a covered porch with a glider that needed new chain. Every surface in that house was occupied, not with clutter, but with the careful accumulation of a long life. Photographs in frames, plants in terracotta pots on the windowsills, a shelf of paperback mysteries she'd read so many times the spines had gone soft. The kitchen smelled like coffee and the cedar sachet she kept in the drawer by the stove. I sat at her kitchen table for a long time that night. I ate a bowl of soup that someone from the church had left in the refrigerator. I found a half-finished crossword on the counter, still in her handwriting, the pen still tucked under the corner of the page. 11 across. Quiet dignity. She hadn't filled it in yet. I went to bed in the small bedroom she'd kept for me since I was a child, and I lay there in the dark with the card on the nightstand. She made arrangements. Call. My grandmother had a checking account and a small savings account. I knew that because I'd helped her balance her register every few months after her eyesight got soft. She had a pension from the county school system. She had the house, which still had a small mortgage because she'd refinanced it in her 60s to help my mother with medical bills. She had her car, a 2009 Camry with 48,000 miles on it because she only drove to the grocery and to church. She didn't have investments. She didn't have a broker. She clipped coupons from the Sunday paper and kept them in a little accordion folder by the front door. I didn't know what a law firm in Memphis could possibly want with any of it. I called the next morning. The man who answered had a calm, measured voice. He said his name was Mr. Calloway. He said he'd been expecting my call. He asked me to confirm my name, my grandmother's full name, my relationship to her. I did. Then he said, "I've been your grandmother's attorney for 22 years. She retained me in the spring, not long after she retired from teaching. She was very specific about what she wanted, and she was very specific about who she wanted handling things after she was gone." I asked him what things. He said, "I think it would be better if we spoke in person." "Are you able to come to Memphis?" I said. "Memphis is 4 hours from Chattanooga." He said, "I know. I'm sorry to ask. but your grandmother asked that this conversation happen face to face. She was particular about that." He paused. "She said you'd understand." I didn't understand. But I went. The office was in a low brick building near Overton Park, the kind of building with no sign out front, just a suite number by the door. A receptionist walked me back to a corner office with 2 tall windows and bookshelves that went floor to ceiling. Mr. Calloway stood when I came in. He was older than his voice suggested, late 60s maybe, with the careful handshake of someone who had spent decades making people comfortable in uncomfortable moments. He poured coffee. He set a folder on the desk between us. He said, "Your grandmother came to me 22 years ago because she wanted to formalize something she'd already been doing quietly for several years on her own." I waited. He said, "Since the early 90s, your grandmother had been making regular financial contributions to a small number of families in the Knoxville area. Former students mostly, and their parents, families she knew were struggling. She did it without telling them who the money was from. She routed it through a church fund at first, and then when the amounts grew, she wanted something with more structure, something that would continue after she was gone." I said, "How much are we talking about?" He opened the folder. The number on the first page was not the number of a woman who clipped grocery coupons. I said, "I'm sorry. Can you say that again?" He said the number again. I put my coffee down. He said, "She was a careful saver her entire working life. She lived on a fraction of her income. She invested early and consistently, mostly in index funds, nothing complicated. She reinvested dividends. She didn't touch it. She let it grow for 30 years. He turned a page. "The foundation has been making disbursements for 22 years. The principal has grown faster than the disbursements." I sat with that for a moment. My grandmother who stretched 1 rotisserie chicken into 3 meals. My grandmother who kept the thermostat at 68 and wore a sweater indoors from October to April. My grandmother who told me once that the most radical thing a person could do was choose not to want more than they needed. I had thought that was just something she said. She called it the Steady Hand Fund, Mr. Calloway said. The name was hers. She said every child deserves a steady hand behind them, even if they can't see whose hand it is. I drove back to Chattanooga that night and I didn't tell anyone. I needed to hold it by myself for a little while, to understand the shape of it. My uncle called me 2 days later. He'd received a letter from the estate, the standard notification about probate, and he had questions. He wasn't cruel about it. He wasn't a bad man. But he'd grown up without much, same as my mother, and the mention of an estate, any estate, had sharpened something in him. He said, "I didn't know Mom had a lawyer." I said, "I didn't either." He said, "What did he say? What's there?" I told him what I knew. I kept the number out of it because Mr. Calloway had asked me not to share specific figures until the documentation was ready. My uncle pushed back on that, gently at first and then less gently. He said he was her son. He said he had a right to know. He said his kids had barely known their grandmother because of the distance, and that was hard, and he wasn't wrong that it was hard. But I also knew that the distance had been his choice, not hers. We got off the phone without resolving anything. I called Mr. Calloway back the next morning. I said, "My uncle wants to contest." He said, "I expected that. Your grandmother expected that too." He said my grandmother had spent several months working through the structure of the documentation specifically to account for it. She had 2 separate attorneys review the paperwork. She had recorded a video statement sitting in her own living room explaining her reasoning in her own words. She had anticipated every question. He said, she knew her son, she loved him. But she also knew that what she'd built wasn't meant to be divided, it was meant to continue. I want to be honest about something. When I understood what my grandmother had left behind, my first feeling was not pride. It was grief, and it was specific. It was grief that I had never known this part of her, that I had sat at her kitchen table hundreds of times and talked about my job, my apartment, my small, ordinary problems. And she had sat across from me with this entire other life running quietly underneath, and she had never said a word about it. I asked Mr. Calloway why. Why the secrecy? Why not tell us? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She told me once that she'd watched people her whole life announce what they were going to do before they did it. She said the announcement always cost something. It changed the doing. She didn't want the credit. She wanted the work to happen. I thought about that for a long time on the drive home. There's a woman I've never met, somewhere in Knox County, who got help paying for her daughter's tutoring 10 years ago. She doesn't know where it came from. She doesn't know that the money came from a woman in a blue cardigan who used to give out stickers for correct spelling. She never will. And my grandmother was fine with that. My grandmother chose that. The legal process took 4 months. My uncle and I had several difficult conversations. There were moments that were painful in the particular way that family money always is. Because it isn't really about money, it's about what the money means, what it says about who was loved and how. What helped was the video. Mr. Calloway had given me a copy on a thumb drive. I watched it alone the first time, sitting at my kitchen table in Chattanooga with a glass of water I forgot to drink. My grandmother was in her wingback chair, the one by the front window. She was wearing the blue cardigan. Her hands were in her lap. She looked directly at the camera. She said, "I am not leaving this to you to punish anyone. I want you to understand that clearly. I chose you because I know what you'll do with it. You've always been the one who asked the right questions, not the loud questions, the quiet ones." She said, "Your uncle will be angry for a while. That's all right. He came from a different kind of scarcity than you did, and scarcity makes people afraid of things they can't hold in their hands. Give him time. Don't fight him. Don't explain yourself more than once. He'll find his way." She said, "The notebook in the second drawer of my desk has the records. Every family, every year, every amount. Read it carefully. You'll understand what I was trying to do." She paused. She said, "Pay attention to the families who've been receiving support the longest. Some of them are ready to step out of it now. Some of them need another year. You'll know. You were always good at knowing." She looked at the camera for a long moment. She said, "I love you. Don't let anyone rush you." And then the video ended. I went back to Sycamore Bend Road in late spring when the probate was nearly finished and the house was officially in my name to manage. The dogwood in the front yard was still in bloom. I stood on the porch for a while before I unlocked the door. The notebook was in the second drawer just where she'd said. It was a green composition notebook, the kind you buy in the school supply aisle in August. The cover was soft with handling. She'd taped a label to the front in her neat teacher's handwriting. Records. SHF. I sat in the wingback chair and I read every page. There were 41 families over 22 years. The entries were meticulous. Date of first contact. Nature of need. Amount disbursed. Date of last contact. Status, ongoing, transitioning, closed. A few had notes in the margins. Daughter started community college. Closed. Father found steady work, reducing. Mother ill, extending through fall. 31 of the families were former students of hers. 10 were families she had identified through community connections, through her church, through a social worker she'd known since the 70s. A woman named Harriet, whom I found a thank you card from tucked in the back of the notebook, though the card only thanked my grandmother for her kindness and guidance without specifics. I counted the years. My grandmother had started this before I was born. She had been doing this quietly, consistently for longer than I had been alive, and she had never needed anyone to know. My uncle called me in June. His tone was different. He said he'd been thinking. He said he'd talked to his wife about it, and his wife had pointed out kindly, apparently, that their mother had given him something his whole life too, and that it hadn't always looked the way he'd expected, and that maybe that was something to sit with. He said, "I'm not going to contest it." I said, "Okay." He said, Can you send me the video? Mr. Calloway mentioned there was a video." I sent it that night. He called me the next morning and didn't say much. He just said, "She knew me pretty well, didn't she?" I said she did. He said, "Take care of it. I mean that. Take good care of it." I told him I would. I am 31 years old. I have a degree in communications and a job I mostly like, and an apartment in Chattanooga with good light and a plant I've kept alive for 3 years. I am not a financial person. I am not a foundation person. I didn't grow up thinking any of this would ever have anything to do with me. But I have been meeting with Mr. Calloway once a month since January. I have been reading everything he puts in front of me. I found a nonprofit consultant in Knoxville who knew a former board member of a similar organization, and she sat with me for 2 hours over coffee and told me what the first year would look like if I was serious. I wrote down everything she said. Last week I drove to Clover Hill Elementary. I didn't go inside. I just sat in the parking lot and looked at the building. There's a new principal now, a young woman who took over a few years ago. The purple and gold were still on the gym doors. I could see from where I was parked. I thought about 31 years of second graders. I thought about all the hands she held, steady so they couldn't feel the trembling that was probably there in her too. The way teachers do. The way she did. I drove home on the back roads. The Tennessee hills in May are very green. She left me a structure and trusted me to learn the rest. I am learning the rest. I've been thinking a lot lately about what my grandmother actually chose. Not what she left, the fund, the notebook, the structure Mr. Calloway helped her build, but what she chose every single day for 30 years before any of that became visible to me. She chose to live on less than she earned. She chose to say nothing when she could have said everything. She chose to give without attaching her name to the giving, and she did it not once. Not in a single generous moment when the feeling moved her, but consistently, quietly, for decades, the way you tend a garden you never expect anyone to photograph. I used to think discipline was about suffering through something, about gritting your teeth and doing the hard thing. But that's not what I saw in that green composition notebook. I saw something different. I saw a woman who had decided very early what kind of person she wanted to be and then simply became that person. One small decision at a time, until the whole shape of her life reflected it. That's not suffering. That's clarity. And here's what I keep coming back to. She was a second-grade teacher. She wasn't a banker or a CEO or someone who inherited wealth she then redistributed. She was a woman who stood in front of 7-year-olds every morning for 31 years and taught them to sound out words and carry a number and be kind to the person sitting next to them. She built what she built on a teacher's salary, with a teacher's patience, using the same mind that knew exactly which child in her class needed to sit closer to the front and which one needed 5 extra minutes and a quieter voice. That's intelligence. Not the flashy kind, the kind that pays attention. The kind that understands how systems work and then uses that understanding steadily over a long time towards something that matters. My uncle needed time. I understood that better after I watched the video a second time. He hadn't been excluded because he was loved less. He'd been passed over for this particular responsibility because my grandmother knew him, genuinely knew him, and knew that what she built required a specific kind of stewardship. That's not punishment. That's discernment. She looked at both of her grandchildren and made an honest assessment and acted on it even knowing it would cause pain. That took courage. The quiet kind. I think about the 41 families in that notebook sometimes. None of them know her name. None of them know that a woman in Knoxville kept their entry in a green composition book, updated it every year, wondered about them. They just know that something came through when they needed it, and then kept coming, and eventually they didn't need it anymore. That's the whole story, from their side. I'm learning, slowly, that the most durable things are built without an audience. My grandmother knew that. She lived it for 30 years before I was born. I'm 31 and I'm just beginning to understand what she was trying to show me, not by telling me, but by becoming it, completely, and trusting that eventually I would see.